Welcome to the Sleep Carriage. My name is Dev. Tonight we're stepping into a smoky, uneven floored world where rest is promised, but not exactly guaranteed. Tonight's story is the peculiar world of medieval inns. Imagine soft candlelight flickering against damp wooden beams, mugs of frothy ale clattering, and a lumpy straw bed waiting for you upstairs. You probably wouldn't survive this in real life, not unless you had an iron stomach and a very forgiving back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the time where you're watching. I love seeing where this little bedtime history club reaches around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the wooden door of a medieval inn. It creaks like it might snap off its hinges. And the first thing you notice is the smell. A mix of smoke, spilled ale, damp straw, and the faint tang of onions. Great. Another day of mud, and here you are, greeted by the aroma of wet boots and questionable cooking. Still, after trudging along rutted roads all day, this feels like luxury. The floor is uneven, made of packed earth in some places, warped boards in others. You shuffle inside, boots sticky from the road, and immediately hear voices. Laughter bursts from a corner, mugs slam on tables, and the whole room is alive with a kind of weary cheer. The air is thick with smoke from a fire that refuses to draw properly, so your eyes sting, and you cough politely, pretending you don't mind. Everyone else looks equally bleary-eyed, so perhaps this is just how it's meant to be. Straw rustles under your boots. Inns in the Middle Ages weren't polished lodgings. They were half tavern, half dormitory, and sometimes half stable too. If you're lucky, there's a fire in the hearth tonight, throwing a warm glow that makes everything seem more welcoming than it really is. You glance toward the benches. Travelers like you sit elbow to elbow. Merchants, pilgrims, the odd soldier each clutching a mug of ale, because water here would be asking for trouble. Historians remind us that ale was the safest option, a liquid bread that kept you from falling ill. Some even say it was weaker than modern beer, so children drank it too. Comforting in its own way, though perhaps less so if you were the one brewing it in a smoky pot. You catch the eye of the innkeeper, a stout figure with arms folded. Innkeepers knew everything. Who came in, who left late, who carried a heavy purse. They watched you like hawks while pretending to be friendly, and you realize you're now part of their mental ledger. Some historians argue innkeepers were part host, part spy, always reporting whispers of suspicious strangers to the authorities, or occasionally turning a blind eye if the coin was good enough. You sit down on a wooden bench, rough and sticky with spilled drink. The table is uneven, and your mug tilts dangerously, but no one else seems to mind. In fact, this is part of the charm. Medieval inns were chaotic, but they were also places of connection. You hear one man telling a story about a highway robbery too dramatic to be true, too detailed to be made up entirely. The rhythm of life here is gossip, laughter, and the steady flow of ale. Above your head, the ceiling beams groan. You imagine the upper floor, a long room filled with straw pallets, everyone crammed together for the night. Privacy is a fantasy, and so is silence. Snoring, coughing, the occasional argument, these will be your lullabies later. Fleas are included in the price. Still, for now, you lean back against the rough wood and let the sounds wash over you. The warmth of the fire, the hum of voices, the faint strum of a lute in the background. All of it mixes into a soothing sort of noise, the heartbeat of the medieval road. And as you sit here, letting the smoke sting your eyes and the ale warm your stomach. You think, this might just be the best kind of weary comfort that the Middle Ages had to offer. The innkeeper stands behind the counter, hands planted on the worn oak, and you can feel their eyes never quite leaving you. There's a kind of unspoken test going on here. Are you the sort of traveler who pays promptly, drinks modestly, and doesn't start fights, or are you the kind who might try to sneak out before dawn? Inns in the Middle Ages had no room numbers, no neat little brass keys. Instead, trust and suspicion mixed together like smoke and ale. You look around and notice how the innkeeper's presence anchors the whole room. The common folk chatter, the pilgrims mumble prayers before their mugs, and a group of merchants count coins in whispers. But above all of it, you feel the weight of the innkeeper's gaze. They were part host, part guard, part accountant, and occasionally part gossip. Some even say innkeepers were unofficial news channels, passing along rumors to sheriffs, priests, or anyone who'd listen. A traveler might leave thinking they'd revealed nothing important, but by sunrise, the whole town could know their business. You reach for your mug, a rough clay vessel that feels heavy in your hand, and take another sip of the warm, flat ale. The taste is earthy, a little sour, but it does its job. Behind the counter, the innkeeper wipes a wooden bowl with a cloth that looks like it's seen better centuries. You're not convinced it's any cleaner than before, but at least the gesture is comforting. From time to time, the innkeeper leans over to whisper with a serving girl, and you catch fragments of words. Prices, names, maybe a complaint about a guest upstairs. Inns were crossroads, and the people who ran them knew far more than they ever let on. One historian even described them as half tavern, half information bureau. And information in the Middle Ages was as valuable as gold. The innkeeper nods at you as if to say, you're safe here for now. It's not unfriendly, but it's also not warm. That's the balance they had to strike. Welcoming enough to keep you paying, wary enough to keep trouble at bay. You wonder how many times this inn has seen a quarrel break out, or a traveler try to leave without settling the bill. Some argue innkeepers were deeply mistrusted, accused of watering down ale or overcharging weary strangers. Others insist that without them, travel itself would have been impossible, since they were the only ones willing to open doors to strangers at all. Behind you, the door creaks again. Another traveler stomps in, shaking off rain. The innkeeper looks up immediately, taking in every detail: the soaked cloak, the muddy boots, the weary shuffle of someone who has walked far too many miles. No words are exchanged, but you can feel it. The innkeeper already has their measure. You sit a little straighter, realizing that even in this smoky, crowded room, you're part of a quiet performance. Every move you make, every coin you jingle, every glance at your neighbor is noted. Inns were places of rest, but they were also places of constant watchfulness. Everyone was a stranger, and strangers could not always be trusted. The fire pops, sending a thin trail of sparks into the air. You lean forward, letting the warmth seep into your bones, and think about how peculiar this balance really is. Hospitality, yes, but always with one wary eye open. Some historians believe this constant suspicion shaped how medieval travelers behaved, keeping voices down, keeping purses close, and always keeping an eye on the innkeeper in return. You sip again, feeling the rhythm of life here settle in. The inn is a place where trust is borrowed for a night and never fully earned. And under the steady, watchful gaze of the innkeeper, you realize you're now part of that fragile rhythm too. You finish your ale and decide it's time to see where you'll be sleeping. The innkeeper points you toward a creaky staircase in the corner, its wooden steps uneven and worn from countless boots. As you climb, the voices below blur into a low hum, the firelight fading until the upstairs greets you with shadows and the faint smell of straw. The sleeping room is not much of a room at all. It's a long hall under the sloping roof, lined with pallets stuffed with straw and covered in thin, scratchy blankets. Privacy is out of the question. You share this space with strangers, merchants snoring like thunder, pilgrims mumbling prayers even as they drift off, and a farmer who, unfortunately, has decided to remove his boots but not his socks. The smell explains itself. You place your bundle down on the nearest pallet and test it. The straw crackles beneath you, lumpy in some places, thin in others. Fleas are a given. You can almost feel the little itches before they begin. Inns in the Middle Ages were notorious for their companions in the bedding. Some historians even joke that fleas were the most faithful guests of all, always present and always awake. To your left, two men argue in hushed voices about the road ahead. One claims to have seen robbers just past the next town, while the other insists it was only a troupe of traveling actors. You're not sure which sounds worse. To your right, a woman pulls her shawl over her face and tries to ignore the racket. Everyone is tired, but nobody really sleeps deeply here. The sounds of the room mingle into a peculiar symphony. Snores of every pitch, coughs that rattle the rafters, the occasional creak of someone shifting on straw, and somewhere, the quiet squeak of a mouse. You think, not unreasonably, that the mouse might sleep more comfortably than you will tonight. Lying back, you study the beams overhead. They're blackened with smoke, as though centuries of fires have seeped into the wood. Some historians suggest that many inns were patched together from old farmhouses, barns, or half-collapsed buildings, never designed to host dozens of strangers. That might explain why the roof feels so low and the draft finds every gap in the wall. You turn on your side, pulling the thin blanket closer. Your neighbor shifts too, muttering something about saints and thieves. Beds in medieval inns were often shared, not because anyone preferred it, but because space was scarce and coin was precious. Sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 travelers would end up in the same bed. You imagine waking to find yourself nose to nose with a stranger who snores and wonders if sleep might be impossible after all. And yet, there's a kind of comfort here too. For all the discomforts, there is warmth in shared company. No one sleeps alone on the road. The snores and whispers remind you that you are not in some empty field or damp ditch, but under a roof, however smoky and drafty it may be. Some historians debate whether these inns were truly as crowded as tales suggest, or if writers exaggerated to make a point about the miseries of travel. Perhaps not every inn crammed guests together like firewood, but judging by the way the floor groans with every shift of weight and the way your neighbor has already elbowed you in his sleep, exaggeration feels unnecessary. You close your eyes, listening to the rhythm of it all. The snoring, the rustling, the whispered gossip that refuses to die down. It is a noisy lullaby, rough but steady, and it carries you further into the peculiar world of a medieval inn's long, crowded night. The morning arrives not with the gentle chirp of birds, but with the unmistakable smell of stew being reheated downstairs. You sit up on your crackling pallet of straw, rubbing your eyes, and hear the clatter of bowls and the low hum of voices already gathering near the hearth. Sleep in a medieval inn is never quite enough, but any food pulls you upright. You make your way back down the staircase, ducking your head beneath a beam that seems determined to scalp the unwary. The common room is hazy again, smoke curling from the hearth where a pot of something thick and brown simmers. The innkeeper stirs it lazily, while a serving girl carries wooden trenchers stacked with bread. The bread is yesterday's, perhaps the day before that, and you notice the edges are already hard. You knock it against the table, and it makes a sound somewhere between a thud and a clunk. Perfect. Breakfast is served. You sit at a long bench with a group of weary travelers. A bowl of stew is set in front of you. You look down into the steaming mixture and try to guess its contents. A little barley, a few onions, maybe a piece of salted pork if fortune favors you. Some say medieval and stew was like the ship of Theseus, always changing, but never entirely new. Each day, scraps of yesterday's meal were added to today's pot, so the stew never truly ended. It was less a dish and more a living tradition, bubbling endlessly on the hearth. You break your bread into the bowl to soften it, the crust soaking up the broth, and take a cautious bite. Salty, smoky, and mysterious. That's the flavor of the road. You glance around the table and see others doing the same, chewing slowly, no one daring to ask what exactly they are eating. Beside you, a merchant loudly declares that the ale here is weaker than the ale at the last inn. He takes another long drink anyway. Ale is the universal companion of meals, whether morning, noon, or night. Water is too risky, milk is often sour, and wine is too expensive for most. So ale is warm, flat, and filling like liquid bread. Children drank it too, though theirs was brewed lighter. You sip again, trying not to think too much about the cloudy bits floating in it. A group of pilgrims at the far end of the table mutter grace before tearing into their bread. They seem grateful for anything, even stew that tastes more like smoke than meat. One produces a pilgrim's badge from his satchel, holding it up proudly, a little lead token from Canterbury. He passes it around, the others nodding reverently before handing it back. You realize the food may be forgettable, but the ritual of eating together, of sharing a meal in this smoky room, is part of what makes inns so peculiar. Some historians note that food was a constant subject of complaint. Medieval travelers wrote about bread too stale to chew, stews with suspicious ingredients, and ale stretched with water. Others argue that innkeepers did their best with what they had, feeding crowds of people on short notice. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. You spoon another mouthful of stew and decide you'll never know which side is right, but you'll keep eating, because the road ahead is long. A juggler, clearly one of last night's late arrivals, takes a seat near the fire and begins to hum while tearing bread into tiny pieces. His presence reminds you that inns weren't just about food and shelter. They were little theaters of life, where everyone from pilgrims to performers shared the same table and the same stew. You lean back, your bowl empty, your bread gone, your ale mug only half drained. For all its rough edges, the meal fills your stomach and warms you, and in the dim, smoky light of the inn, that feels like a small miracle. The stew has settled, the ale has gone warm in your belly, and the long bench beneath you creaks as someone pulls up a lute. The instrument looks worn, its strings slightly out of tune, but no one seems to mind. In a medieval inn, Music is never about perfection. It's about filling the smoky air with something lighter than coughs and gossip. The first notes are hesitant, plucked like testing the mood of the room. Then, slowly, a voice joins in. It's not a grand performance, more of a sleepy ballad, the kind of tune you've half heard before, wandering through marketplaces or drifting from a passing cart. The melody is simple, but it carries. You feel the noise of the inn soften, mugs pausing in midair, conversations slowing as people lean just a little closer to listen. Songs in inns had many lives. Some were about knights and battles, epic tales turned into drinking tunes. Others were cheeky ballads, with verses just bawdy enough to earn a laugh, but not so bold as to get a scolding from the priest if he happened to wander in. Tonight's song is somewhere in between. A wandering tale of a miller who loses his horse, told with just enough humor to make even the pilgrims smile. You tap your fingers on the rough wood of the table. The rhythm matches the lute, and soon others join in, the whole room swaying with the slow beat. The sound grows warmer, thicker, as if the music stitches everyone together: merchants, pilgrims, farmers, and the odd thief pretending to be a merchant. Some historians say that inns doubled as performance spaces, especially for wandering minstrels who lived by passing their hat after a song. A good ballad meant a free mug of ale or a crust of bread, and the songs themselves carried stories from town to town, bits of news stitched into rhyme. A tune could be half entertainment, half newspaper, spreading tales faster than letters ever could. The lute player finishes his verse, and laughter ripples through the room. Someone claps too loudly, nearly spilling his mug, and the player grins, launching into something faster this time. The rhythm changes. Feet stamp on the straw-strewn floor. A woman at the far end hums along, and soon voices are weaving together in a tangle of sound. Not exactly harmonious, but close enough for a roomful of weary travelers. You glance at the fire. Sparks rise with the beat, almost dancing themselves. The smell of smoke and ale mixes with the music, and you find yourself smiling despite the stiffness of the bench and the ache in your feet. There's something comforting about it. The way these songs have likely been sung in countless inns before, in countless smoky rooms just like this. Some historians debate how much of this music survives unchanged. Were the songs we know today really the same ones heard centuries ago? Or have they been reshaped so many times that the originals are lost forever? The thought flickers through your mind as the lute strums louder, but you let it drift away. Tonight, the sound is what matters, not where it came from, but the way it fills this moment. The song ends with a final pluck and a ragged cheer. Mugs are raised, bread is broken, and the inn hums with that peculiar warmth again, the warmth of people sharing not just food and fire, but stories carried in song. You lean back, close your eyes for a moment, and let the music settle into your bones. The music lingers in your ears even after the lute falls silent. The chatter returns, louder this time, voices layering over one another until the room feels like a tide of sound rising and falling. It's in this tide that you notice the subtle game of reputation unfolding. At a medieval inn, where most travelers meet only once, reputation is everything. You've barely spoken, yet people glance at you, weighing your clothes, your boots, even the way you hold your cup. Are you a pilgrim, harmless and devout? A merchant with a coin tucked safely away? Or perhaps a highwayman playing at respectability? The truth is, in these places, nobody knows for certain. And that's part of the fun or the danger. You overhear two men at the far end of the table. One brags of his journey from Flanders, his words dripping with the smell of salted fish he supposedly brought across the sea. The other nods, unimpressed, claiming instead that he once dined with a bishop. Both of them are probably exaggerating. But here, exaggeration is almost expected. Inns thrive on stories, and the bigger the boast, the more the ale seems to flow. Your own seatmate leans toward you, his breath heavy with onions. He tells you that he is a scribe, hired by noblemen to copy their letters. He claims his hand is so steady that not a blot falls on the page. But the stains on his tunic suggest otherwise, and the missing tip of his quill, tucked behind his ear, makes you wonder if he has written anything at all in weeks. Still, you nod politely. In inns, you rarely challenge the tales people spin. Some historians believe that medieval inns acted like miniature marketplaces of gossip. Merchants spread news of prices in distant towns. Pilgrims carried stories of shrines and miracles, and soldiers, when they passed through, offered tales of battles, stripped of their darker edges for easy retelling. Information traded hands as easily as coins. In fact, for some villagers, the inn was the only place to hear what was happening beyond a half-day's walk. There's a curious phrase from the time: "An innkeeper's ear is worth a penny a mile." It meant that if you wanted to know what was happening far away, the innkeeper was your best bet. They heard everything, remembered most of it, and shared it in careful drips, like ale from a tilted cask. You glance at the woman behind the counter now, her eyes sharp even as her hands are busy pouring. She knows who has lied, who has coin, and who is pretending to be braver than they are. The reputations built here could stick. A merchant who seemed too generous might find himself followed by thieves. Pilgrim too quiet might be thought suspicious. And then there were travelers who, through nothing more than luck, gained a glowing tale that followed them to the next inn. Some historians suggest these reputations could even turn into folklore. A single bold traveler, telling his story at one inn after another, might eventually transform into a legendary figure. Was he really that brave, or did his story simply grow in smoky rooms like this, with each retelling sharpening his heroics? The line between truth and myth often blurred on straw-covered floors. The man beside you sighs dramatically and finishes his ale. He swears he once copied a love letter for a noblewoman so beautiful that the ink seemed to shimmer as it dried. You smile, half amused, half unconvinced. Great. Another story that probably isn't true. But it doesn't matter. The rhythm of life here is not about truth. It's about passing the time, weaving identity, and surviving the long night in company rather than silence. The room swells again with laughter, mugs clink, and for a fleeting moment, you feel yourself drawn into the game. You consider the story you might tell if someone asked. Perhaps you'd claim to be a traveler from a far-off land, someone who has seen wonders these villagers couldn't imagine. Or maybe you'd keep it simple, just a weary soul passing through. After all, in an inn, sometimes the simplest story is the truest. The room swells again with laughter, mugs clink, and for a fleeting moment, you feel yourself drawn into the game. You consider the story you might tell if someone asked. Perhaps you'd claim to be a traveler from a far-off land, someone who has seen wonders these villagers couldn't imagine. Or maybe you'd keep it simple, just a weary soul passing through. After all, in an inn, sometimes the simplest story is the truest. Pilgrims are easy to spot. Their clothes are simple, worn thin by endless walking. Some carry staff tipped with iron. Others wear badges pinned proudly to their cloak, tokens from shrines visited along their route. A seashell badge means they've walked the road to Santiago de Compostela. A cross from Canterbury marks a visit to St. Thomas Becket's shrine. These trinkets are more than decoration. They're proof of devotion, and sometimes even protection, as if the saints themselves traveled with the bearer. The innkeeper greets them without surprise. Pilgrims are regulars in these places, a steady trickle on the roads that never quite dries up. Their coin is usually small, their appetites large, and their stories long. They huddle together on the benches, their packs stacked neatly by the door, and order the cheapest food the inn can provide. You watch as one of them, an older man with a weathered face, pulls out a flask. He offers a sip to his companions, and they nod gratefully. His voice carries as he begins recounting the road they've taken, describing the rivers they forded, the shrines they passed, the blessings received. His words are tired but steady, practiced by repetition. He has probably told this same story at a dozen inns already, and he will tell it at a dozen more before he reaches home. Pilgrims were more than travelers of faith. They were walking vessels of connection. Their stories knitted towns together. Their footsteps linked villages to holy places hundreds of miles apart. At an inn, their presence was a reminder of the vast world beyond. They carried both news and holiness, and for some villagers, touching a pilgrim's badge was thought to bring good fortune. Yet, as you notice, not everyone listens with reverence. Some smirk at their threadbare cloaks. Others dismiss their tales as exaggeration. Pilgrims were admired, yes, but also mocked. To some, they seemed little more than beggars with walking sticks. And in truth, not every pilgrim's journey was purely spiritual. Records suggest that many went on pilgrimage to escape debts, avoid trouble at home, or simply see the world. One pilgrim at the table, a younger woman with bright eyes, produces a tiny scrap of parchment. On it, faint ink marks the blessing she received from a distant abbey. She passes it around like a treasure. The others nod, envious or proud, depending on their own badges. You realize that, for them, the inn is not just a stop along the road, but a stage upon which their devotion can be displayed. The innkeeper sets down a pot of stew before them, and the pilgrims eat quickly, murmuring prayers under their breath. Their presence shifts the room. Conversations soften, the more ribald songs quiet a little, and even the boastful merchant at the far table lowers his voice. Pilgrims command a kind of respect, whether earned or not. They remind everyone that the world is not only ale and quarrels, it is also faith, endurance, and the hope that every weary mile brings you closer to grace. As the older pilgrim finishes his story, the younger woman begins one of her own. She describes a night spent sleeping under the stars, the cold sharp against her bones, the sudden terror when wolves howled from the hills. The room listens, spellbound. For a moment, the smoky inn seems to open outward into that vast dark road, and you feel the chill she describes as if it were your own. Then, the fire pops, the spell breaks, and mugs are lifted once more. The pilgrims tuck into their food, their journey paused but not ended. Tomorrow they will walk again. Tonight, they rest in the peculiar comfort of straw and smoke, surrounded by strangers who will forget their names but remember their stories. The night deepens, and with it the character of the inn seems to change. By now, most who arrived at dusk have settled into their chosen corners. The noise has softened, the weariness of travel and drink pulling voices into slower, sleepier rhythms. Yet in this drowsy lull, you notice something new. A quiet game unfolding at the far end of the room. Two men sit opposite each other, a small board balanced on their knees. The firelight flickers across smooth wooden pieces, marked with simple carvings. It takes you a moment to recognize at tables the medieval ancestor of backgammon. The rules are different, though familiar enough. Dice rattling in a wooden cup, pieces moved along a track, fortunes changing with every throw. Gambling was the shadow companion of inns. Where there was ale, there was always a chance to wager. The stakes were rarely coins alone. Sometimes a knife, a cloak, or even a promised service might change hands. To gamble was not simply to play, but to risk dignity, pride, and future favors. The church railed against it, yet the rattle of dice remained as common as the creak of the floorboards. You watch the men lean forward, voices hushed, each roll met with a muttered prayer or a groan. Around them, a small cluster of onlookers has formed traders, servants, even a boy who pretends to sweep the floor while sneaking glances at the board. The innkeeper notices but does not intervene. A game keeps guests awake, keeps them drinking, keeps coins flowing across the counter. Elsewhere, another game begins. This one needs no board, only words. Two traveling jongleur, musicians by trade, begin trading riddles. Their voices rise in playful challenge. What has a mouth but never eats? What has a bed but never sleeps? Laughter ripples through the room as guesses are made. Wrong answers rewarded with good-natured jeers. These riddles, half poems and half puzzles, were a favorite pastime, a way to pass the long nights before sleep. And in between games, there is always a song. Not the polished hymns of churches, but rough tavern tunes, work chants, and fragments of ballads passed from one village to another. Someone begins humming a melody about Robin Hood, though the words shift with each singer, half remembered and half invented. You notice how easily the room joins in, voices blending with no rehearsal, no conductor, just the shared memory of a story carried through song. The inn itself becomes a kind of stage, a place where performances unfold not by design but by necessity. To live so close to strangers demanded entertainment. Silence was heavy. Stories, games, and music made it lighter. And in a world without books for most, without theaters for the common folk, the inn was where culture breathed. As you listen, you realize that inns were more than just places to eat and sleep. They were crucibles of memory, keeping alive the tales of saints, outlaws, lovers, and kings. What you hear tonight might one day be repeated hundreds of miles away by someone who learned it here. A dice throw, a riddle, a tune, small things, but stitched together, they became the fabric of medieval social life. The dice clatter once more. A cheer rises as one player sweeps the board clean, his opponent scowling, his purse a little lighter. A riddle is answered with a burst of laughter, followed by applause. The fire burns low, but the night is not yet finished. And you, sitting quietly in the corner, feel as though you are watching the pulse of the age itself, faint, smoky, unsteady, but very much alive. By now, the hour is late, and the inn grows drowsier. The games fade, the singing turns to murmurs, and one by one, travelers drift toward the narrow staircases that lead to their beds or what passes for beds. If you follow them, you soon find that sleeping in a medieval inn is no gentle luxury. The rooms above the common hall are small, crooked spaces, their walls thin as parchment and their ceilings low enough that a tall man must stoop. Instead of private chambers, you are often placed in a shared dormitory. Privacy is rare, reserved for the wealthy, and so you, like most, must share a mattress or a bench with strangers whose names you hardly know. The bedding itself is rough. A frame of wood, perhaps rope-strung, supports a lumpy sack stuffed with straw. If you are lucky, the straw has been changed within the past few months. If unlucky, you will feel it poking through the thin cloth, smelling faintly of mold and sweat. Over you lies a blanket of coarse wool, scratchy and heavy, designed more for warmth than comfort. You settle in, but sleep does not come easily. All around you, the noises of other travelers keep the night alive. One man snores so loudly it shakes the boards. Another coughs with a rasp that seems to echo. A child whimpers in the dark, soothed by her mother's whispered lullaby. The floor creaks as someone stumbles to relieve themselves, careful not to wake too many others. And then there are the fleas. Every account of medieval inns seems to mention them, the small, unseen tormentors that made travelers itch through the night. Insects were part of life, carried on clothing and animals, impossible to fully banish. You feel them sometimes crawling, biting, testing your patience. Perhaps the worst part of all is knowing that your companions are enduring the same, and that you are all scratching together in the dark. Still, there are moments of strange coziness. The warmth of many bodies makes the room comfortable despite the chill outside. The smell of smoke lingers faintly from the hearth below, mingling with hay and wool. A candle flickers on a shelf, casting soft shadows. And despite the noise, there is a sense of shared humanity, of being on a long road, resting in the same fragile shelter. Some inns kept a watchman awake at night, dozing near the hearth with a cudgel in hand. His role was to deter thieves, for inns were as famous for theft as they were for hospitality. Yet theft often came not from outsiders but from fellow travelers. A careless merchant might wake to find his purse missing, his boots gone, his horse stolen from the stable. You slept with your belongings close, your hand on your pouch, your dagger under your blanket. Morning came early whether you wanted it or not. The first to rise would often wake the rest, stomping on the boards or calling for the host. Roosters crowed outside, carts rumbled in the street, and already the day's new travelers were arriving, demanding food and drink. There was no late slumbering in the world of inns. Beds were not permanent havens but brief interruptions in the road's long rhythm. And so, though you might not have slept deeply, you had slept enough. You rise, stiff and weary, but also oddly renewed, for such was the way of travel in the Middle Ages. The inn was not a sanctuary, but it was better than the open road, with its dangers and its cold. You dress, shake the straw from your cloak, and prepare to descend the narrow staircase back into the waking life of the inn. Below, the fire has already been stirred, the smell of ale and bread once more drifting through the smoky air. Travelers from the night before nod at you in passing, each already gathering their bundles, their stories, their destinations. Sleeping in a medieval inn may have been restless, scratchy, and noisy, but it was also part of the adventure, part of the larger tale of moving across the land in a time when roads were uncertain, nights were long, and inns were one of the few oases where human company gathered. And as you step once more into the heart of the common hall, you realize that the peculiar world of medieval inns was not merely about food or lodging. It was about shared survival, about the fragile comfort of strangers gathered together in the flickering firelight, carving out a moment of warmth in a cold and uncertain age. The morning light seeps through cracks in the shutters, pale and silvery. Downstairs, the inn awakens, and with it, the smells of the stable drift in a reminder that an inn is not only a refuge for travelers, but also a resting place for their beasts. In fact, many medieval inns existed as much for horses as for humans, and sometimes it seemed the animals had the better deal. You follow the innkeeper's boy outside, his bare feet quick on the frosted ground. Beyond the hall lies the stable, a long timbered structure patched with thatch, its doors creaking as he pulls them open. Inside, the air is thick with the mingled scents of hay, manure, sweat, and leather. Horses stamp and snort in their stalls, shaking frost from their manes. The sound of their breath clouds the chill morning air, a reminder of their power and presence. For many travelers, their horses were their most precious possession. Merchants depended on pack animals to carry goods. Knights and messengers trusted steeds to carry them swiftly. Even pilgrims sometimes hired mules to bear their burdens. To neglect the beasts was unthinkable, so a good inn had to provide not only a bed for the traveler but fodder, water, and straw for the animal. Yet it was not uncommon for the horses to receive fresher bedding than the men. Stalls were replenished with hay more often than guest mattresses. The stable boy worked tirelessly, mucking out waste, filling troughs, spreading straw. A weary rider might grumble about lumpy straw upstairs, while his horse stamped on a clean pile of hay below. Stables, however, were not quiet. At night, horses shuffled, chewed, or whinnied, their sounds drifting into the inn's sleeping rooms. The smell, too, was inescapable. Inns were often built close and compact, and a shift of the wind might carry the odor of manure right through the cracks in the floorboards. Guests who complained were often told simply, "Better this than the wolves outside." Danger lurked in stables as well. Thieves knew that stealing a horse was worth far more than stealing a cloak or purse. A sturdy destrier could be sold for a fortune. Stable doors were bolted at night, but stories abound of daring rogues cutting loose mounts in the dark. Travelers often woke with dread, rushing out to find their most valuable companion vanished into the night. For all that, there was a curious intimacy between man and beast in the world of inns. A rider often slept with ears open, half listening not for footsteps in the hall but for the restless snort of his horse. A sick animal meant disaster for the journey ahead. More than once, travelers chose to bed in the stable itself, lying close to their horse for warmth, security, and companionship. To modern ears it may sound strange, but in the bitter cold, the body heat of a beast could be more reliable than a scratchy wool blanket. There were two odd traditions tied to the stable. Some inns marked themselves with carved signs of horseshoes or bridles, promising good care for animals. Others became known for the quality of their hay or the swiftness of their stable service. A well-kept stable meant a well-regarded inn, and in towns along the great trade routes, reputation mattered. As you stand there, the innkeeper's boy brushes down a chestnut mare, humming under his breath. He works quickly, his hands practiced, for he has done this every morning of his young life. Soon, the travelers will be calling, saddles tightened, bags loaded, hoofs clattering on cobblestones. The stable will empty, its breath and warmth fading until evening brings a new crowd of beasts to fill it again. The stable, in its way, was as alive as the hall itself, a place of movement, noise, and necessity. It was not glamorous nor pleasant smelling, but it was vital. For without the horses, the travelers could not travel, the merchants could not trade, the pilgrims could not journey, and the inns themselves would wither. And so, as you breathe in the mingled scents of hay and horse, you realize that the medieval inn was not a place apart from animals, but one bound up with them, sharing walls, roofs, and fates. Here, humans and beasts endured the same road, the same weather, the same uncertainties. It is a peculiar world indeed, where a nobleman and his warhorse might rest under the same roof as a farmer's mule, both watched over by the sleepy eyes of a barefoot boy. Yet that was the world of medieval travel. Strange, rough, and inseparably tied to the creatures that carried it forward. By now you have come to understand that an inn was never just a bed and a roof. It was a business, a responsibility, and sometimes a danger. This was why the law kept a close and watchful eye upon the trade of innkeepers. Step too far into corruption, and an inn might be shuttered. But keep too loose a house, and it could easily become a nest for thieves and runaways. In medieval England, statutes dating back to the 13th century required innkeepers to answer for the goods and persons under their roof. If a traveler's possessions went missing, suspicion fell first upon the host. There were tales of crafty innkeepers who conspired with robbers, slipping word to bandits about wealthy merchants, or even dosing cups with sleeping herbs. To combat this, the crown levied rules and punishments. Some towns made innkeepers swear oaths of honesty before the local courts, their reputations bound by law as much as by custom. Taxes, too, were a certainty. Inns were lucrative gathering places. Travelers spent coins. Merchants struck bargains. Ale flowed freely, and so lords and councils demanded their share. Licenses were issued, fees collected, and regulations laid down. To run an inn without permission could bring heavy fines. Even ale was controlled. By law, it was to be sold at a just price. And ale tasters, officials of the town, went from tavern to tavern, sipping and sniffing, declaring what was fair and what was deceit. Yet, for all their rules, authorities also depended on inns. They served as staging points for royal messengers, who galloped from town to town with the king's orders. Inns kept records of guests, a form of crude surveillance, so that vagrants and suspicious wanderers could be tracked. A sheriff or bailiff might call upon the innkeeper to answer questions, or to produce a traveler suspected of crime. And when the hue and cry went up the call to chase down a criminal, it was often the inn where men armed themselves and set out into the night. Of course, not every inn was virtuous. Chronicles speak of dens of vice, where gambling, prostitution, and brawling went unchecked. In some towns, ordinances required curfews. The alehouse shutters must be closed by a certain hour, lest drunkards disturb the peace. In London, laws declared that no man should lodge more than he could answer for, a reminder that too many strangers in one place could be a recipe for mischief. And then there were the accusations. Inns were often blamed for harboring highwaymen, rebels, or even spies. An inn near a border might shelter men of dubious loyalty. A quiet room at the back could serve as a meeting place for conspirators. In this way, the inn stood at the uneasy crossroads of hospitality and suspicion, a place both necessary and dangerous. Yet despite all these anxieties, inns survived. Some even thrived, becoming semi-official stations along the great roads, trusted by both crown and council. Their signs hung proudly over their doors, symbols of legitimacy, reassuring travelers that this was no mere alehouse but a lawful and reputable lodging. So as you sit by the dying fire, listening to the creak of shutters and the faint shuffle of boots above, you realize that every inn was more than timber and smoke. It was a link in a chain of law and order, a place where the movements of strangers were recorded, where the king's peace extended into the weary night. And perhaps it is no surprise, then, that the innkeeper always kept one eye open. For the law, like the road, never truly slept. The inn was never meant to be a fortress, and yet it often faced calamities that tested its timbers and the patience of all within. Chief among these disasters was fire. With open hearths blazing in the common rooms, candles guttering on trestle tables, and torches smoking along the beams, the threat was constant. A single spark might leap into the rushes strewn across the floor, dry and brittle from weeks of trampling. In moments, the warmth of the inn could turn into a roaring inferno. Travelers told grim tales of inns lost to flame, of guests fleeing in nightshirts, their possessions vanishing in smoke. It was why some innkeepers grew cautious, setting stones around the hearth, or keeping buckets of water ready by the door. In larger towns, ordinances even required that lanterns be snuffed by a certain hour, though such rules were more often ignored than followed. And yet, despite the dangers, the flicker of fire was what made the inn feel alive without it. The night was too empty, too cold. Then there were the fights, not the grand battles of kings and knights, but the smaller quarrels of restless men packed too close together. A spilled cup of ale, a jostle at the bench, a poorly chosen word, and suddenly fists flew. The clatter of overturned mugs, the scrape of stools on wooden floors, the high bark of the innkeeper's wife trying to restore calm. Most of these brawls ended quickly, with bruises and wounded pride. But every inn carried scars of such moments. A cracked beam, a dented wall, or a story retold for years after. Sometimes, however, the quiet disasters proved more lasting than the loud ones. A thief moving unseen through the sleeping quarters, slipping coins from purses and rings from fingers. A sickness carried by a weary traveler, spreading among guests before anyone knew what it was. Inns were crossroads, and with crossroads came contagion, of rumor, of illness, of trouble. There are accounts of plague sweeping through towns where inns became unwilling hosts, their beds suddenly feared, their doors bolted shut. Floods could ruin them too. A swollen river might rise overnight, filling the cellar with muddy water, spoiling barrels and soaking grain. Roofs collapsed under heavy snow. Roads washed out, leaving an inn stranded without travelers for weeks. Some disasters were sudden and fierce. Others crept in quietly, emptying the purse as surely as any thief. And yet, the inns endured. They were built not for perfection but for persistence, patching roofs, mending walls, hauling in new rushes, starting again after every misfortune. The fire might scorch the beams, the quarrel might bloody the floor, but by the next evening, the hearth would blaze again, and the benches would fill with weary souls in search of warmth. For that was the truth of an inn. It was not its walls that mattered, but the constant stream of people who came and went, carrying stories, laughter, anger, and song. Even in disaster, the inn remained what it had always been, a gathering place, fragile yet enduring, full of noise and life, and sometimes silence that pressed heavy on the rafters. So, as you drift deeper into thought, you realize that the dangers of an inn were never enough to keep people away. After all, a traveler's road was long, and the night was always colder without the comfort of a fire. You picture yourself now as a pilgrim, your boots thick with dust, your cloak stiff with sweat and rain. The road behind you is long, and the road ahead feels endless. But tonight you find a small inn nestled along the pilgrimage route. Its sign is plain, painted with a scallop shell, the mark of St. James, or perhaps a cross, announcing its welcome to those who travel not for trade, but for faith. The door creaks open, and you step into a space that smells of wood smoke, wax, and stew. This inn is not grand, not made for lords or merchants. It is simpler, cheaper, and filled with others like you, travelers who walk for devotion, penance, or hope. Pilgrims gather here in every season, some limping, some laughing, some silent with exhaustion. The benches are crowded, the air warm with shared breath, and yet the mood is gentle, as if all understand the weight of the journey. Pilgrims' inns were often tied to monasteries, or run by those who wished to earn God's favor by offering rest to the weary. In some places, such as along the Camino de Santiago in Spain, whole networks of these inns or hospices sprang up, ensuring that no pilgrim went too long without shelter. They were rarely luxurious. A pallet of straw, a wooden bowl of broth, a bench by the fire, that was enough. And yet, in the eyes of a weary pilgrim, they were miracles. You share a table with strangers, though by the end of the night they no longer feel like strangers. One has come from far-off Flanders, another from a fishing town on the coast of Brittany. Each carries a story, and around the fire, stories flow as freely as the thin ale. Some tell of relics they hope to see, a saint's bone, a shard of the true cross. Others confess quieter reasons, the hope of healing, the longing to leave sins behind. Pilgrimage was not only about reaching a holy site, but about the fellowship along the way, and inns became the vessels of that fellowship. The oddities of these inns were many. In some, the innkeeper might wash your feet, offering water warmed by the fire. In others, a strict silence was enforced after dark, as if to remind the guests that their journey was sacred. Meals were often humble lentils, bread, a little cheese, but offered with solemnity, and pilgrims learned to accept each crumb as part of the path. And yet, even on holy roads, not all was holy. Some inns along pilgrimage routes became notorious for trickery, watering down the ale, overcharging the desperate, or even robbing the unsuspecting. The more cynical travelers warned, a scallop shell above the door does not guarantee piety within. Still, pilgrims came because the road demanded rest, and rest demanded trust. Some historians wonder whether these inns were more important than the shrines themselves. After all, the shrine was the goal, yes, but the journey was what shaped the pilgrim. And the inn, that fragile, smoky, crowded place, was where the journey slowed enough for reflection, where aching feet could rest, where prayers were whispered into straw pillows, where bonds of friendship grew between strangers. You drift deeper into the sound of soft voices, the shuffle of weary boots, the rhythm of a journey shared. In this inn, there are no lords, no serfs, only travelers who, for one night, belong to the same road. The scallop shell above the door gleams faintly in the moonlight, and you think that perhaps this, too, is a kind of shrine.